Bonjour à tous. As developers, we want to deliver things fast and with a high quality. And I believe that in order to do this, we need two things. We need a good code, but I think we also need a good team. So with code, we don't really have a reliable way of measuring how many issues we have, how bad our code is. But we do tend to look at some things to get a feel. So we look maybe at static analysis issues. We look at the number of bugs or the number of crashes that our app has. Or in general, we kind of get the feel of how long it takes to deliver a new feature. So I think the best unit of measurement for all of this is waterfalls per minute. And I think there's a direct correlation between WTFs and the developer happiness. More precisely, as one goes up, the other one goes down. So even if we can't really measure this, we do tend to track issues. So we do tend to use, Jira or Buganizer or whatever tracker you're using to keep, a track of all the issues in our code base. And we see that, this list tends to increase most of the times and increase. But what about team culture issues? These are not issues that end up in a bug tracker. And usually, the main symptoms of a team culture issues are the number of people that are leaving. Afterwards, indeed, new people are joining the company. But because these issues aren't really fixed, aren't really addressed, this starts becoming a vicious circle. And the thing with these problems is that they usually take longer to fix. And that's because their solutions are things that we need to apply every day. These solutions need to actually become routines as part of our daily lives. So then we can say that the number of code issues and the number of team issues are directly related to the developer happiness. So how do we solve these problems? How do we get to a good code and a good team? I think we share a lot of best practices when working with code. And I believe that there are a lot of things that we can learn from code and apply in teams as well. So in this talk, I want to talk about my experience as an individual contributor. So as a simple team member, not a team lead, like probably a lot of you here are. And I want to tell you about some of the most important practices that I try to follow in code. And also, I want to tell you how these can apply when working with other people. Some are things that I do manage to apply every day. Some are things that I strive to apply. So modularization is the first one, because it's something that I've been thinking and working on a lot in the last few months. So in the last few months, together with some of my colleagues, I've been working on refactoring Plaid. And we've been trying to modularize this initially monolithic application. So one of the main advantages of modularization is scaling. So initially, we start with a small code base, usually also with a small team. With time, the app starts to grow. The number of people that work with it also starts to grow. But as the app grows, separating the areas of the app in modules allow us to better work on specific areas, decreasing the amount of conflict and allowing us to merge code faster. So you should split the project and allow parallel work on your code base. Next is maintainability. So when we're working with a monolithic app, we usually have, for example, all the layout resources in one folder. When we're splitting the app into modules, these resources become split. We keep files separated to make them easier to maintain. Next, modularization brings with it faster compilation. So, for example, let's say that we need to modify the same file, the comment layout, in a modularized app and in a monolithic one. In the monolithic one, modifying that XML will trigger a rebuild of the entire code base, whereas in a modularized app, it will only trigger the rebuild of that specific module. Okay, so how do we start? How do we modularize? So you can either modularize by feature or by layer. Let's start with feature. So what we're working a lot lately is dynamic delivery. So through dynamic delivery, users can download and install dynamic features on demand. So this means that modules can be added at runtime or removed at runtime. So in thinking, what are the best features that would apply, that would work with dynamic delivery, I usually try to apply the 80-20 principle. So this says that 80% of your users are using 20% of your app. So try to look at what's the rest of the 80% of your app. What are the areas that are not part of the core flow of the app? And consider these for modularization. So, for example, you can take something like paid features to be in a separate module, or expert features. These can be downloaded later, only when the user paid for something, for example. But also consider features like onboarding, that the user only gets to see once, right after the app starts. This is a good candidate for a module that can be uninstalled later after the user passes this. And the property of modularization that I like best is encapsulation, because this means that you can't directly use classes from other modules. So this means that you're avoiding accidentally creating a tight coupling of the code. So in our app, we modularize things a bit differently. So our app aggregates data from 3 different news sources: Designer News, Dribble, and Product Hunt. And to keep all of these sources separate, we decided to put all the classes related to each of them in their own separate modules. This also allows us to easily plug in new features. So, for example, if you want to support something else like Unsplash, we can easily just add it. This, again, also enforces encapsulation. So similarly, separation by feature and separation by layer help us with encapsulation. So because every feature is contained in the view model, and then each module is afterwards separated into layers, which we define as the UI, domain, and data layer, it means that if we're modifying something in the data layer, so for example, let's say that we're switching from saving data in shared preferences to saving data inside a room, it means that the UI won't be aware of this, and it doesn't need to be aware. The next step for modularization to restrict this API usage even more would be to separate these layers also in libraries. So you would have different libraries for the data, the domain, and the UI layer. Like this, you definitely guarantee that the UI layer, because it doesn't have a direct reference to the data layer, it won't use the code that's there. So modularization brings you scale, maintainability, and fast compilation. But what does this mean for teams? I think the most important element, or one of the most important elements with modularization, is ownership, and ownership within a team. Separating responsibility within a team lets you focus better on the feature and truly own that feature. So, for example, in Plaid, I stepped up and took ownership of the Designer News source. This allowed me to work on fixing the way we're communicating with the backend, to improving the UI. So I was really able to own that feature entirely, to think about what's the best user experience that I can provide for our app users, but also what's the best code that I can provide for this feature. So this was, for me, an opportunity to grow and to learn, thinking about both the user of the app and other people in the team. But then, because I'm owning a feature, it means that I'm also responsible for it. The code I own is expected to work. So similarly with owning features, you can also own technologies or libraries. So for example, in Plaid, we have different technology champions. In our case, for example, Ben is the one that's handling dynamic feature modules. So it means that I know that if I have any question related to that, he will be the person, he will be the expert that can help me. Because ownership and responsibility also help build trust. So for example, also with Ben, a few weeks ago, we were working on a solution for splitting code into different modules and having the right classes loaded at runtime. I started working on my part, but then I got to that point where I was starting to work with dynamic feature modules, where my knowledge pretty much stopped. And that's the part where Ben can take over. And together, we were able to actually ship that PR, ship that feature. The thing is that trust, both professional and personal, builds up with time. I think we're quick to judge and quick to assume the worst in people. So instead of actually trying to understand the other person. So I think that not only you should strive to do your best, but in the same time, you should also consider that at any given situation, the other person also did their best, given what they knew at the time and the restrictions that they have. So try to understand also their point of view. I think in development, one of the principles that we can also learn a lot in teams is the single responsibility principle. One of the parts of the single responsibility principles is avoiding God classes. So we know that initially, a few years back, we had a lot of our code into activities. Then view models appear, and then we knew that, OK, the code shouldn't be in the activities. We should move all of that inside the view models. So instead of having very big activities, we ended up with very big view models. Similarly, when we're working with dynamic feature modules, this is something that can happen when we're talking about the base module. We ended up actually putting a lot of things in that base module that didn't really have to be there. So we ended up with a God module. Next, if you want to split this, if you want to define where things should be so they're not all in one class, well, you need to define an architecture vision. You need to define, OK, if the code isn't in the view model, then where is it? So that's what we did. So we looked at each of our layers, and we sketched out what the main classes are and what the main responsibilities and dependencies are. So for example, for the data layer, we will be working with a local data source, a remote data source, and a repository. And then for each element, we looked at, for example, for the local data source, what's its role? What are its dependencies? What's its input? And what's its output? So we established all of these for all of these main classes. And that helped us create a common language. When we said that, OK, we need to create a new local data source for this, we knew what we mean. Similarly, we also defined on how things should communicate. So for example, we knew that the repository that's at the edge of the data layer should always expose suspend functions for things that take a long time to run. So pretty much this is the architecture vision that we have. This is what we were striving for. So these layers will be part of each feature module that we had. So what does single responsibility mean for team? As we have God classes, similarly, we have people that keep all the knowledge, that have just been working in the app for a lot of time, or have just been able to touch a lot of the parts of the application. So start doing things like knowledge sharing sessions or pair programming sessions. So with dynamic feature modules, for example, what worked great for me from learning from Ben was actually implementing something and having Ben reviewing that code and then learning from the reviews that he made, from the suggestions that he made. But even when you want to share knowledge, there are multiple ways of doing that. Sometimes you just want the fish. Sometimes you want to learn how to fish. So for example, when I was refactoring some code that was also touching some broken animation code, I had to fix it. But I knew that that was not the time or place for me to get started with animations. So I just reached out to Nick, who's our UI magician, and I just asked him to give me the fish, to give me the solution for that problem. That's all. That's all I needed at that time. But in other cases, for example, I had a problem with Dagger, so I reached out to another member of the Android community, Zach Swears, and I asked him, how do I make this work? And his answer was, Do you just want the code? Do you want me to just tell you the code and that fixes this? Or do you want me to teach you why this doesn't work? So he took his time, and he guided me towards the better solution, towards the solution. And that was time-consuming. But then it was also rewarding afterwards when I ended up in a very similar situation that I already knew what the problem was. I already understood how Dagger works in that case, and I could fix it by myself. So teaching how to fish, it can be more time-consuming, but I think it's worth it long run. And if you're working alone, if you don't have any other team members in your Android app, and if there's no one to teach you how to fish, well, look around. Look at this amazing Android community that we have. So why not start talking to each other and collaborating and learning from each other? So we defined an architecture vision because we want to have a path defined. We want to know how a dream architecture looks like. Like this, for new features, we knew directly what direction to go. But then for existing features, we could better evaluate what are the steps needed to go towards that dream architecture. And actually, it's the same with us. We want to progress and learn. That's why you're here. But how? In which direction? And where are we now so we can understand how far we are from that goal? That's why I think it's important to understand where you are and where you want to go. But deciding where you want to go depends on how far in advance you want to look. You can look at things at short term. So for example, what are the APIs or skills that you want to build? Do you prefer to be a specialist, knowing everything there is to know about animations, for example? Or you want to be a generalist that is able to touch the entire code in the app? Do you want to try new technologies or libraries? Even with the talks that you end up going to these 2 days, these will be actually reflections of these choices that you're making. Then midterm, you can think of where you want to be in a couple of years. Do you want to continue being an individual contributor? Do you want to be a tech lead? Do you want to be a team lead? Do you prefer working in a small team? Do you want to work in a big team? Do you want to switch to Kotlin native, for example, and do cross-platform? And then long-term, it can be something in, 5, 10 years from now. Do you want to own your own company? Do you want to work at a startup? Do you want to work at one of the big fives, the Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft? So in the end, all of these goals allow you to take control of your career. And then you could work with your team lead, so you can pick the tasks that allow you to build the skills that you need to get there. Like this, you can ensure that you're working on the things you like, making you happier at work and more productive. So you're able to build those features faster. But to do this, I think there are a few steps that we need to make. First, we need to define these goals. But to define these goals, we need to understand what motivates us, understand what we like and what we don't. So even if you say that right now you're happy where you are, try to understand why. What do you enjoy about what you're doing right now? Because it means that those things that make you happy are things that you want to keep. So then once you start becoming unhappy with your job, it's easier to understand why and what are the things to change. What's the direction to move towards? So for example, in my case, I know I like to code. I want to feel that my work is impactful, and I want to have people around me from whom I can learn. And one of the reasons why I left the previous company was because I was working on a startup where a bunch of features I spent so much time working on weren't really used by anyone. So the impact of my work was 5 people, out of which 3 were testers. So at my current job, I also know that if there are days when I don't code, I become unhappy. So then I try to keep a balance of everything I like. My manager is aware of these issues, or is aware of what I like, what motivates me, so then we're working together to ensure that my happiness level is high. Then, once you understood what motivates you, try to set those goals. But then sometimes I look back at what I did in the last few months, and I wonder, what did I actually do? What did I learn? So tracking what I learned and my achievements actually allowed me to see the progress that I'm making. I try to track every day what I learn. I have actually a reminder for this towards the end of the working day. Other folks I know have a calendar block every Friday where they try to track what they did, what they achieved and learned that week. And what's really important is to actually show up for those reminders, those calendar events, because in the end, you're showing up for yourself. Try to create a routine out of this. And while on a day-to-day basis, things can seem quite minor, like, okay, I only did this thing today. Well, with time, when we get to the milestone checks, then these small things actually add up. If you look back to 3, 6, or 12 months before, depending on when you're setting your milestone, things can actually look quite big. So these milestone checks can represent both a deadline that you're saying until that time I want to increase my Kotlin skills, for example. But also they're a point where you get to retrospect, to look back and recalibrate, to understand what your goals are right now. Because, hey, your goals actually can change. And if your goals can change, what are the skills that you need to get you to the new goals? And if you say, I don't know what my goals are and what motivates me, I think that's still a valid answer. But at least try to think about this, because like with the architecture vision, this also takes time, but it will provide us the guidance that we need. The next one is communication between components. So we said that our app is modularized, it's split into multiple layers, but then each of these modules also get to communicate with the backend. Chances are they also get to depend on a library. Maybe we even have a library that's shared between multiple modules. For example, in Plaid, we have a Markdown library that we use in multiple modules. Then chances are a lot of your modules, or all of your modules, maybe depend on the base module. So how do you communicate between all of these? So in order to better communicate between APIs, a set of usability principles were established. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I assure they're actually really interesting. But I will look at a few of them, the ones that I think are more relevant for our topic. So the first one is consistency. In our case, in Plaid, we said that both the data and the domain layer will just expose suspension functions for everything that's long-running. So this creates a pattern in the mind of the developer that implements something similar features, or of the developer that needs to work on the existing features. It creates a set of expectations that allow us to operate faster, to ship things faster. Next is providing a flexible API for simple, but also for complex use cases. So this is not from Plaid, it's from the Android framework. If you want to display a text with bullet points, you would use a bullet span. By default, the only thing that you need to provide is the color of that bullet. That's all. But it also allows you to set a few more things. So for example, the bullet radius, so how big do you want that bullet point to be, but also the distance between the edge of the screen and the bullet. But if you have a more complex use case, let's say that instead of a bullet, you want to show a heart, the span API also allows you to override the draw leading margin method to implement that custom code. So this means that this API allows both simple and complex use cases. Next API principle is helping users recognize, diagnose, and recover from error. So the last week, I tried to add the latest support for Room for coroutines in Plaid. So what I did, I just added the suspension word in front of the function. But then I quickly realized that I got an error. Because to use the coroutine feature, you must add a specific artifact. And I've spent so much time trying to look on other APIs on, OK, what's the artifact this API actually belongs to? So the fact that Room was able to provide this super helpful suggestion of, like, hey, this is the artifact that you need, meant that I just copy-pasted that in my build.gradle file, and I was able to recover from that error. So the usability principles that I covered were consistency, flexibility, and help for errors. But actually, all of them, not just these, have some things in common. As a developer, you're thinking of the user of your work. Will they be able to easily work with the API? Will the API cover most of the use cases that it might be used for, that are needed? What will your users do, or what will your API users do when they encounter an error? So it means that you need to put yourself in the shoes of your user and then make sure you communicate the right way to go, which actually translates to two things that are generally valid: empathy and communication. So if our API needs to be flexible, well, so do we when we communicate. You are responsible for making sure that the person you're communicating with understands what you mean. So you need to make sure that you're targeting the message and the way it's delivered to your audience. So think about their knowledge and experience. Will they know what you mean when you're trying to compare the live data flat map method with the RxJava flat map method? Do you know these well enough? Does that person know these well enough to understand your analogies? But then also think about their personality. Are they someone shy or someone too proud that won't ask you for clarification? Then think about the context in which you're trying to communicate something. Are you in a noisy environment? Or maybe the person you're talking with is in a rush or under stress. Based on that, consider how and when you need to deliver your message. So when we're communicating with the backend, we're expecting a 200 OK to know that our message was received and interpreted correctly. Make sure you get that 200 OK from the person you're communicating with as well. So if empathy is at the basis of communication, I believe that communication is at the basis of collaboration. So sharing the knowledge means that we all learn. As developers, the problems that we face actually tend to be quite similar. So I think we should avoid reinventing the wheel every time. So actually, we should learn from each other. We should apply and iterate on the solutions that our peers found by communicating better. Next is something that I think we all do almost every day: creating pull requests. For me, pull requests are a great way to learn and to improve both the codes and myself, my knowledge. I've learned so much from my teammates. But a lot of times, our PR description looks something like this. They didn't really say much, and they weren't really helping the reviewer. So what we found a few weeks ago was actually this pull request template that Rebecca created. And we decided to adopt it also in Plaid. So we learned from Rebecca, from what she shared, and we iterated on it. And this is what we ended up with a pull request that shows the type of change that we made, the description, like a quite detailed description here that Manuel added, but also like how did we test it and why did we do it. But creating a pull request means that you're asking and you're receiving feedback. In the pull request world, the PR writer is actually the feedback requester, and the PR reviewer is the feedback giver. So I'm going to approach this, the asking and receiving feedback, from both angles. So as a PR writer, you're putting out your PR for review for one main reason. You want to get that code merged. But the reason you're not merging it directly into master is because, as a team, you want to ensure that the code you push is correct and good enough to be merged. So when we're creating a PR, the expectation is that we're open to have our work reviewed, that we want suggestions for improvements, and that we're willing to admit that we're wrong or that there's a better way to handle something. And most of all, that we're committed on fixing those mistakes. But we don't always have that attitude outside the code, and this holds us back. It stops us from growing, from realizing and utilizing our potential. So I think we should have this open, willing to learn and improve attitude for everything, for all areas, all types of feedback, not just code, so we can actually grow. So let's say that you're working on a bigger change on your code. So if you only request feedback after 2 weeks of working on it, and only then you're told that, hey, actually, your architecture approach is incorrect and you should just start from scratch, well, you just wasted 2 weeks. So make sure that you're asking for feedback early. Create maybe draft PRs, and make sure that you're on the right path from the beginning. Ask for help. And also take the same approach in other situations. Let's say that you're starting a new job. Ask from your manager for feedback after a few weeks. Don't wait for the end of the notice period to find out how you're actually doing. Then ask for specific feedback. If you're doing a code refactoring, for example, ask for input on your architecture, mentioning that to your reviewer at that time, that at that time, you only care about architecture. You don't care yet about any typos or method names and so on. You just want to make sure that your architecture is OK. Similarly, when doing talks or articles, I like asking for feedback on the narrative when I'm still at the outline phase. Then we all have our knowledge, strengths, and weaknesses. So make sure you approach the right person for the right problem. If I'm working with dynamic feature modules, I know for sure I'm going for Ben first for advice before creating that PR. As a feedback giver, first, make sure that the feedback you're about to give is wanted. Is it the right time for it? Will your feedback actually be helpful? Does that person want to discuss this specific topic? And if the answer to all of this is yes, then let's see how you can make sure that you're giving good feedback. So when giving feedback, you have to have 3 things in mind: the situation, the behavior, and the impact. So for example, I had a code that was iterating through a list of data sources, and it was calling load more on each of them. So at the review time, Manuel pointed towards the situation in the GitHub by creating a comment on the specific line, pointed to the behavior that the code is sequential, which is also the impact that we will have to wait for all the requests to come on a row when we can actually make them parallel. Similarly, when we're talking about personal feedback, you need to be as precise as you are with the code. So recently, in our team group chat, I said something in a joke. And then a few seconds later, a colleague asked me if that was actually a passive-aggressive comment towards another colleague. So the situation was clear. Our group chat on a specific topic. The behavior was that my comment sounded passive-aggressive. And the impact was that it could have hurt the feelings of that third colleague. So this allowed me to apologize to my colleague and make sure that my joke didn't come across to him as passive-aggressive. Which actually brings me to my next topic, which is feedback should be timely. So sure, you can give feedback on a PR after it was merged, but by then, it can be too late. The code or the priorities of the PR writer might have changed. So giving timely feedback means that you're not letting it become a bigger thing. You're not letting your feelings bottle up, and maybe even your opinion on someone change because of that. Hopefully, that meant that my colleague didn't thought that I'm an asshole after I apologized. Then make sure that your feedback is as specific and thorough as possible. Go deep into details, into pointing out what was wrong, but also what was right. The feedback doesn't need to be just negative. So speak up when you see something good as well. And in the code, speak up when you see something good. And then focus on the facts you've seen and make it about the work, not about the person. Don't say you're wrong choosing this solution, but rather, could this work better? But then when you're receiving feedback, how should you react? The first thing should be that you should listen, take it in, and then embrace it positively, saying things like, Thank you for telling me this. I didn't know I came across this way, or I haven't thought about this solution. Next, while it's easy for us for the first reaction to be a defensive one, to blame things on someone else or on some constraints out of our control, don't become defensive. But rather, take responsibility for your performance, for your problems. Don't create excuses or blame. Don't adjust the truth so you don't have to adjust to it. Then try to understand how things are from the other person's point of view. Try to understand how they were affected by your behavior. And then now that you know what can be improved, go into the problem-solving mindset and think of how you will improve. By reacting like this, you're strengthening the relationship with your feedback giver. Whereas if you're becoming defensive or even aggressive and start blaming others, you're going to alienate people. So look at modularization of how scale, maintainability, and faster compilation go towards ownership and responsibility and trust when working with teams. We saw how single responsibility principle translates into sharing knowledge and understanding where you are and where you want to go. Usability principles all said one thing: empathy, communication, and collaboration. And then for pull requests, we ended up having all sorts of suggestions around feedback. But if this is too much, I would say this: focus on collaboration and empathy. I think that by working together, we can get much further than we would individually. But to do this, we need empathy. By building a good team that communicates and respects each other, this will have that ripple effect on the other teams, on the other people that you're interacting with. So give a shit. And maybe you'll also get one back. Thank you.